In 1949, a truck rolled out of Cleveland, Ohio that changed the shape of every highway in America. It was lower, sleeker, and smarter than anything on the road. The company that built it had been making vehicles since before the Wright brothers flew. Within 30 years, that company would be dead, erased, sold to the Swedes for parts. The workers who built it would lose their pensions. The factory would become a vacant lot, and the truck itself would be forgotten by everyone except the old-timers who still remember when it was king. This is the story of the White 3000. To understand why this truck mattered, you have to understand what came before it. And what came before, it was miserable. The cab-over-engine trucks of the 1930s and 40s were tall, boxy, punishing machines. The driver sat perched directly on top of the engine, 6 or 8 feet off the ground, like a man straddling an oven with wheels. The heat radiating through the floorboards was relentless. Summer runs through the Southwest meant cab temperatures cracking 130 degrees. There was no air conditioning. There was barely ventilation. The vibration from the motor transmitted straight through the seat into your spine. 12 hours of that, day after day, and your back was finished by your mid-40s. Your knees were shot from climbing in and out of a cab that required a ladder to reach. And when something broke, which happened regularly, you had to tear the entire cab apart just to reach the engine, pull the seats out, remove floor panels, disconnect wiring harnesses, hours of labor before you could even see the problem. Nobody loved these trucks. They existed for one reason. The federal government said your entire rig could only be so long, roughly 55 feet, bumper to tail light. A conventional long-nosed truck used up too much of that with the hood and engine compartment. Less trailer behind the cab meant less cargo. Less cargo meant less money. So the industry built cab-overs, stacked the driver on top of the engine, shortened the tractor, put every possible inch into the trailer. The math was sound. The human experience was brutal. The White Motor Company had been building trucks since the First World War. Before trucks, they made sewing machines. Before sewing machines, steam-powered automobiles. The story begins in Cleveland in 1876, when Thomas H. White founded the White Sewing Machine Company. Sewing machines, bicycles, roller skates, automatic lathes, phonographs, a bit of everything. Then Thomas's son Rollin got curious about automobiles. Around 1898, he purchased a locomobile steam car, discovered its boiler was dangerously unreliable, and decided he could build a better one. He did. Rollin White developed a new water tube steam generator using stacked coils with 2 innovations. The coils joined at the top so water only flowed when pumped, giving precise control of steam generation, and steam was pulled from the lowest coil, closest to the fire, allowing careful temperature management. The White steamer became the second best-selling steam automobile in the country, behind only the Stanley steamer, outselling its nearest competitor 2-1. But Thomas White, the patriarch, thought automobiles were a passing novelty. His sons disagreed. In 1906, Rollin and his brothers Windsor and Walter organized the White Motor Car Company on Canal Street in Cleveland's Flats District. They produced their first vehicle under the White name in 1909. When World War I arrived, the company had shifted entirely to trucks. Over 18,000 military vehicles during the war, roughly 10% of the entire American truck market by 1918, from a sewing machine family. After the armistice, they stayed with trucks and became the #1 manufacturer of heavy-duty commercial vehicles in the United States. The Depression nearly killed them. In 1932, White merged with Studebaker just to survive. 2 years later, they reorganized independently as the White Motor Corporation. Robert Fager Black took over as president and handled a labor crisis with uncommon decency. Workers at the East 79th Street plant had organized UAW Local 32 in 1933, one of the first automobile unions in the country. They struck. In an era when companies hired goons and locked gates, Black sat down and talked. He listened. The strike was settled through negotiation. He polled customers. He met with employees regularly. White recovered strong. World War II redirected everything to military production. The East 79th Street plant built military cargo trucks, M3 half-tracks, and war components. When the war ended, America's economy exploded. Goods needed to move coast to coast, and the trucks available to move them were the same clumsy cab-over designs drivers had cursed for 2 decades. Here was the engineering problem nobody had solved. You needed a cab-over layout to maximize trailer length within the 55-foot limit. But you also needed a cab low enough for drivers to enter and exit dozens of times daily, cool enough to work in during summer shifts, and designed so mechanics could service the engine without a multi-hour teardown. Not Mack, not International Harvester, not Kenworth had checked every one of those boxes in a single truck. White's engineering team in Cleveland asked the question nobody else had acted on. What if you do not put the driver on top of the engine at all? What if you move the entire cab forward, placing the driver in front of the engine? The White 3000 debuted in 1949, and it looked like nothing else on American roads. The cab was pushed forward, well ahead of the engine compartment, so the driver's legs and feet occupied space in front of the motor rather than above it. This single conceptual shift cascaded through the entire truck's design. The floor of the cab dropped dramatically lower because there was no engine block underneath it requiring clearance. The seats sat at a normal, comfortable height because they did not need to clear valve covers and intake manifolds beneath the floor. The whole cab rode closer to the ground, which meant getting in and out was more like stepping into an automobile than scaling the side of a building. Forward visibility improved because the driver was looking ahead over a short nose, rather than peering down from a perch near the roofline. And the center of gravity dropped significantly, making the 3000 far more stable at highway speeds and in the crosswinds that plagued tall, top-heavy cabovers on the open plains. But the signature innovation was the tilt cab. When you needed to work on the engine, you hit a switch. An electric motor activated a hydraulic pump that pressurized a single ram at the front of the frame. The entire cab, seats, dashboard, everything pivoted forward on hinges at the base of the cab's front wall and tilted up to roughly 45 degrees. The engine was right there, open air, full access from every angle, no crawling, no removing floor panels, no disassembling the driver's workspace to reach spark plugs. One switch. In 1949, electric hydraulic tilt cabs did not exist on production trucks. White created the concept and built it into a vehicle anyone could order from a dealer. The heart of the 3000 was White's own engine design, the Mustang Flathead 6-cylinder, designated Model 250A, a big, honest, understated gasoline power plant producing roughly 215 horsepower. That is not a number that quickens anyone's pulse or makes posters for garage walls. But trucks operate in a fundamentally different reality than sports cars. Nobody running a freight business cares about your peak horsepower figure. They care about one thing: whether the truck starts every morning and runs all day without leaving the driver stranded. The Mustang Flathead did exactly that. It fired reliably at 4 a.m. in a Minnesota January and ran smoothly through a full shift without complaint. Drivers who logged serious mileage behind these engines reported dispatch reliability in the high 90s, meaning out of every 100 scheduled runs, the truck completed 97 or 98 of them without a mechanical failure requiring service. For a freight company calculating operating margins to the penny, that reliability number is worth more than any horsepower figure ever printed in a brochure. The drivetrain paired that engine with a 5-speed Clark non-synchronized transmission and a 2-speed rear axle, producing 10 forward gears total. The Clark was what truckers called a crash box, no synchronizers. Every single shift demanded double clutching, the driver matching engine revolutions to gear speed by sound and feel and instinct alone. Miss it, and the gears ground loud enough to hear from the sidewalk. This was standard practice for heavy trucks of the era, and it separated skilled wheelers from rookies every time. The two-speed rear axle was controlled by an electric switch on the dash. Low range provided 5 close-ratio gears for pulling heavy loads up mountain grades or maneuvering through tight city streets where a wrong turn put you in an alley with no room to swing. High range gave 5 taller gears for open highway cruising. Drivers said the Mustang engine with that 10-speed combination would pull a fully loaded 40-foot trailer at 70 miles per hour all day long, smooth, steady, and quiet enough to carry on a conversation. The kind of truck you trusted with your livelihood. The 3000 won awards for industrial design. People in the industry called it the round cab white because the styling featured flowing curves and smooth contours replacing the flat, stamped metal brutality of earlier cabovers. Hidden door hinges, a surprisingly modern dashboard layout, Art Deco influences in the bodywork that gave the truck a sense of purpose and dignity beyond its utilitarian function. For a working truck in the early 1950s, design recognition was practically unheard of, but the 3000 earned it. These trucks were everywhere. Consolidated Freightways, one of the nation's biggest carriers, ran enormous fleets of them. The Milwaukee Journal newspaper used tandem axle 3000s to haul papers across the entire state of Wisconsin. College students drove them on delivery routes for extra money. Municipal governments from coast to coast bought them for sanitation work, snow removal, and public utility fleets. Fire departments ran them as far away as Caracas, Venezuela, Portland, Oregon. Put them in the city transfer fleet running loads between the coast and downtown. If you were alive and living in any American city during the 1950s or 60s, you saw round cab whites on the streets every day. You probably never gave them a second look. They were as common as mailboxes. If you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. We cover stuff like this every week. All right, back to it. Now let me walk through the engineering details that made this truck work. The cab-forward layout sounds simple. Just move the cab forward. But it required rethinking the truck from the frame up. Pre-war cabovers had the driver over the front axle, on top of the engine, heat below, vibration constant, high center of gravity making the truck unstable in crosswinds. White's approach moved the driver forward of the front axle entirely. The engine sat behind the cab seat position, not below it. The floor dropped because no engine block needed clearance beneath the seat frame. The Mustang Flathead 6 was specifically engineered for this packaging. A flathead or L-head engine has a lower physical profile than an overhead valve design because the valve mechanism sits beside the cylinders, in pockets cast into the block, rather than riding on top in a tall valve train assembly. No rocker arms protruding above the head, no tall valve covers requiring clearance. This meant the engine bay needed less vertical space, and the cab seats did not need to be elevated to clear components above the motor. The practical result was a truck cab that rode lower than any comparable vehicle on the market. For drivers entering and exiting that cab 30 or 40 times a day on urban delivery routes, this was not an ergonomic footnote. It was measured in years of functional mobility versus years of joint replacement surgery. The tilt cab mechanism itself was an elegant piece of engineering. An electric over hydraulic system with a single ram did all the heavy lifting. When mechanics needed engine access, they activated the system and the entire cab assembly pivoted forward on front-mounted hinges, rising to roughly 45 degrees and exposing the complete engine, transmission, bell housing, and all auxiliary systems from above. Conventional trucks of that era required opening a butterfly hood and working blind past exhaust manifolds, wiring looms, and accessory brackets to reach anything behind the front cylinders. The rear half of any engine, where the transmission bolted on, was essentially inaccessible without major disassembly. With the 3000, a mechanic stood on the ground and reached every component from any angle in seconds. Oil changes, tune-ups, belt replacements, major overhauls, all happened faster. Every hour saved in the shop was an hour the truck was back on the road making money. That arithmetic added up fast across a fleet of 20 or 50 or 100 trucks. The air brake system built pressure quickly and held it reliably, critical when stopping tens of thousands of pounds of loaded trailer at highway speed. The fuel system used dual saddle tanks straddling the frame rails with a selector valve between them, keeping weight balanced side to side and providing solid operating range between fuel stops. As diesel power became dominant through the 50s, the 3000 adapted. White fitted them with the Cummins NH220 diesel, a taller engine than the Mustang Flathead. This meant raising the cab, deepening the fenders, and adding auxiliary radiators with a shaft-driven fan at the rear of the cab. The truck grew a little taller, lost some elegance, but gained the torque and efficiency that interstate hauling demanded. Sleeper cabs appeared for long-haul drivers. The 3000 stayed in production for roughly 2 decades. Single axle for city work, tandem axle for heavy freight. That kind of longevity is remarkable for any commercial vehicle. So what killed the company that built it? Ambition, then gravity. Through the 1950s, White Motor Company was soaring. Revenue climbed from $130 million in 1950 to $770 million by 1967, nearly a 6-fold increase in 17 years. The company launched an acquisition campaign that looked brilliant on paper and in press releases. Sterling Trucks in 51, Autocar in 53, REO in 57, Diamond T in 58. They also maintained a lucrative distribution agreement with Consolidated Freightways to sell Freightliner trucks through White's nationwide dealer network. 4 major truck brands under one corporate roof, plus Freightliner distribution revenue flowing in. They called themselves the Big Four. It looked unstoppable. Then in '68, White bought Euclid, the off-road heavy hauler company, hoping to break into the construction and mining truck market. This is where things started to unravel in earnest. The acquisition loaded the balance sheet with heavy debt. The off-road market stubbornly refused to deliver the returns the financial projections had promised. Cash was flowing out faster than it was coming in, and the truck divisions were being starved to service acquisition debt. White tried to merge with White Consolidated Industries, the original sewing machine company they had split from 6 decades earlier. The federal government blocked the deal on antitrust grounds. Years later, Washington reversed itself and approved the merger. But by then, neither party wanted it anymore. The moment had passed. Separate merger talks with Daimler went nowhere. Negotiations with Renault collapsed. White was trapped, over-leveraged, and running out of options. In desperation, they brought in Seaman Bunkie Knudsen. If that name means anything to you, it should. Bunkie's father, William Knudsen, had been president of General Motors from 1937 to 1940, before Roosevelt tapped him to run wartime production. Bunkie himself was MIT educated, a genuine product of the automobile industry who had literally assembled his first car from parts his father gave him as a teenager in pieces. He rose through General Motors to become the youngest general manager in Pontiac division history at age 43. He hired John DeLorean away from Packard. He brought in Pete Estes from Oldsmobile as chief engineer. Together, they transformed Pontiac from a stodgy brand into a performance icon, launching the wide-track Pontiacs and pushing the division to 3rd place in industry sales by 1962. Bunkie Knudsen was, by any measure, one of the most capable automotive executives in America. Then he stunned Detroit by jumping to Ford as president, recruited personally by Henry Ford II. The tenure lasted exactly 19 months. Lee Iacocca and a coalition of career Ford executives waged a systematic political campaign against the outsider, and Henry Ford eventually let him go in September of 1969. When reporters pressed Ford for an explanation, he offered his famously laconic answer: "Things just did not work out." The joke that circulated through Dearborn was a twist on Henry Ford Sr.'s famous statement that history is bunk. Around Ford, it became bunky is history. This was the man White Motor hired to perform a corporate resurrection. A brilliant executive who had been shown the door at both General Motors and Ford. He posted a $20 million profit in 1973. But White's problems were structural and decades in the making, and no single leader could reverse them. Knudsen sold off roughly a third of the company's assets, including, with some bitter irony, the profitable Euclid operation whose acquisition had helped trigger the financial crisis. He relocated headquarters from the Eerieview complex in downtown Cleveland out to Eastlake. He slashed employment across divisions. Most consequentially, he moved truck production out of the historic East 79th Street plant to non-union facilities in Virginia and Utah. The Cleveland factory, where UAW Local 32 had represented workers since 1933, was demoted to parts fabrication. The blows kept coming from every direction. In 1974, Consolidated Freightways terminated the distribution agreement. Freightliner became an independent manufacturer and distributor, taking a massive chunk of White's revenue out the door permanently. The 1973 oil crisis hammered demand for heavy-duty trucks across the industry. The 1979 crisis hammered it again harder. Foreign manufacturers from Japan and Europe began offering trucks with superior fuel efficiency, eroding what domestic market share White had managed to retain. By '79, White's lighter truck range had withered to just 13,330 units produced for the entire year. Long-term debt stood at $91.2 million, down from $186 million the prior year, but still crushing. On September 4, 1980, White Motor Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. At the time it was filed, it ranked among the largest corporate bankruptcies in American history. Over the next 14 months, the company hemorrhaged $311 million. In August of '81, Sweden's AB Volvo purchased all of White's truck-producing plants and the associated brand names. All of them, except one. The Cleveland plant on East 79th Street. Volvo examined the aging facility, examined the enormous pension liabilities attached to the thousands of active workers and thousands of retirees associated with it, and walked away. They wanted the brands and the modern production capacity. They did not want the obligations to the human beings who had spent their careers building White trucks. Those pension obligations became the darkest chapter in the entire story, and the one most people never heard. White had 6 pension plans covering its workforce. All 6 were terminated without adequate funding to meet their obligations. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal agency that serves as backstop for failed pension plans, filed 17 separate claims against the White estate, totaling more than $67 million. The United Auto Workers submitted an additional $4 million claim for benefits the PBGC did not guarantee. In total, approximately 45,000 individual claims were filed against the bankrupt estate, adding up to $1.5 billion. Workers who had spent 20, 30, 40 years building trucks on East 79th Street discovered that the retirement security they had been promised, the pensions they had accepted in lieu of higher wages during contract negotiations, were worth a fraction of what they had been told. The collective bargaining agreements were rejected during the bankruptcy proceedings. The East 79th Street plant was sold off in '83. After years of protracted litigation, White Motor Corporation formally ceased to exist in 1985. 80 years of American industrial history, dissolved in a federal courtroom in Cleveland, Ohio. Volvo kept the White name alive for a while. They formed Volvo White Truck Corporation, which continued building trucks under the white nameplate through the 80s. In '88, Volvo merged the operation with General Motors' heavy truck business to create White GMC. That brand survived until '96, when Volvo finally retired the white name from the trucking industry permanently. Consolidated Freightways, the once dominant carrier that had relied on White's dealer network for decades, shut down permanently on Labor Day weekend of 2002. Freightliner survived and today belongs to Daimler Truck, a German company. The irony there is thick enough to cut with a wrench. Today the name White means essentially nothing to most Americans. It has been completely scrubbed from the highways. Ask someone under 40 about white trucks and you will receive a blank stare. Ask someone over 60 and you might see something pass across their face. A memory. Their father drove one. Their grandfather worked the line at the Cleveland plant. They saw round cab whites on the highway when they were children, the Mustang flathead humming smooth and steady underneath that distinctive tilting cab. A few 3000s survive. Lovingly restored examples appear at truck shows and concours events across the country, maintained by collectors who understand the magnitude of what was lost. Barrett-Jackson has auctioned pristine specimens. One meticulously restored 1953 model was used by the die-cast model company First Gear as the master template for all their scale reproductions. That truck had appeared on magazine covers and at shows for years. Other 3000s are not so fortunate. They sit in fields and behind barns across rural America, floors rusted through, Mustang engines seized solid, tilt cab hydraulic rams frozen in place by decades of corrosion. Every year there are fewer. The factory tooling is gone, destroyed long ago. The engineers who designed these trucks have passed away, and they took knowledge with them that was never committed to paper or digital files. But here is what matters. Every cab-over truck rolling down every highway, on every continent today, tilts its cab forward for engine access. Every single one. That was the White 3000's gift to the world. The low cab forward design concept that White introduced in Cleveland in 1949 became the global standard for modern commercial truck architecture. The European cab-overs from Volvo, DAF, Scania, MAN, and Mercedes-Benz that dominate roads from London to Tokyo and from Berlin to Sydney all descend architecturally from what a team of engineers at a former sewing machine company figured out while Harry Truman was still in the White House. White Motor Company built the truck that showed the world how cab-overs should work. The world took the lesson and forgot who taught it. The company that was once the biggest name in American trucking got swallowed by its own ambitions, absorbed by a foreign corporation, and dissolved in a Cleveland courtroom while thousands of workers fought over pension benefits that had already evaporated. The White 3000 was a promise that American engineering could lead the world, that a company born from sewing machines and steam engines could define the future of commercial transportation, that building something right, building it smart, and building it to last would be enough to survive. It was not enough. The ideas lasted. The company did not. And the men and women who built those trucks at 842 East 79th Street in Cleveland, who showed up every morning, shaped the steel, assembled the cabs, tightened the bolts, and drove finished rigs off the production line with genuine pride in what they had made. They are the ones who carried the real weight of 3 decades of boardroom miscalculation they never had a voice in. The White 3000, the king of American highways, quietly erased. And there you have it. The truck that taught the world how to tilt a cab, made by a company the world chose to forget. If your family has a white truck story, or you have seen one of these in person, gleaming at a show or rusting behind a barn, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, go ahead and subscribe. We do this every week.